month. So we are continuing our series on the support of the kingdoms, especially the northern kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, which you get about 10 nations in the northern kingdom and 2 nations. I think it's Simeon that gets swallowed up into Judah, with the divide going back to the time of after Solomon's death, with Solomon's son Rehoboam taking the reins and getting into kind of like a cock match, is how some people might say. I'm trying to clean that up, but it's essentially kind of what it ends up being. In fact, there's also some very colorful language that alludes to that particular bodily anatomy, where there kind of comes the last straw for the northern kingdom, and they decide to break up following Jeroboam. Last time we did cover this, so I don't plan to spend too much time talking about this other than to highlight it in the context of what we're going to talk about as the southern kingdom, with Jeroboam being the first king around 931 BC. This is going to become a little bit important later, because that 931 is how most people date the beginning of the official reign. There's also a particular event that takes place at this time that the Bible mentions that is collaborated by history. And that's going to become more important when we talk about the southern kingdom. He is replaced by a king called Nabib, who was assassinated after only 2 years. Someone else is here, so they'll come back in, but we're just going to recap. Baasha a little bit later, Elah a little bit later, also assassinated, a common theme with kings in the book of the Bible. Zimri, who only lasted 7 days and probably was not a very good 7 days if he committed suicide after 7 days, probably didn't want the responsibility in the first place. And then what would become as the greatest king in the northern kingdom and the greatest dynasty of the northern kingdom, and that was Omri, who himself lasted about 40 years and built the capital in Samaria to kind of centralize the government there. Worship would be centralized in 2 different places, in Bethel and Dan, but the whole idea is to move away from the Jerusalem identity that has already been thoroughly established. He is replaced by Ahab, who gets quite a bit of a mention with his marriage to Jezebel and his opposition to Elijah. Uzziah, who eventually who falls and dies. Jehu, the end of the Ahab dynasty, and submitted to Assyria, paid tribute. Normally when they say submitted, they mean they paid tribute to in some way, which is very common in those old treaties. You normally have a nation paying vassal tributes to bigger ones. Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, they all were considered the 3 big at the time. Later to be replaced by Persia. Wow, I'm drawing a blank. Greece and Rome. I think I'm missing one in there too. Joash replaces Jehu, who is defeated by Judah and Aram, to give Jeroboam the longest reigning monarch in the northern kingdom. He lived during the time of Amos and Hosea. He was replaced by Zechariah, who was assassinated, ending the Jehu dynasty. He is replaced by Shallum. He only made it a month, also assassinated. Mehem, Pekah, and Pekah allied with Aram against Judah, and Hoshea, it's very similar to, that extra H in there is throwing me off. I keep wanting to say Hosea. Hashish, how would you say that? Hosea, okay. Last king eventually carried away into exile. I mentioned that King Omri establishes worship, and well, not King Omri, but Jeroboam establishes worship in both Dan and Bethel, and we see some shrines dedicated there. That's the Gate of Dan. This probably predates Israeli settlement, meaning that originally this gate system was not built by the Israelites, but probably popularly used by them. You can see some examples of the shrine there. This is a reconstruction, which normally you would be able to see a reconstruction line, but it guess depends on where they started. I don't really see any reconstruction line in that photo. But was eventually later rebuilt during the Hellenistic period. I think this starts in around 400 BC. So much later, after they were already taken into exile. Some more pictures. It's quite green there, especially compared to a lot of other places. Bethel is a little hard. There were some excavations done supposedly at Bethel, done by W.F. Albright, who, if you study Israeli archaeology, is probably one of the grandfathers of archaeology for Israel at that time. Found it was an Iron Age settlement, which fits the time period. Found fortification walls and domestic structures, and for all intents and purposes, this probably is Bethel, or at the very least, it is a settlement, or an Israeli settlement. But unlike Dan, they did not find any large platform or temple foundation, and of course, no one was going to find a golden calf statue. I have to wonder how long something like that actually lasted anyway. Something made of pure gold just sitting out in the open screams, "Come take me." Some people don't really think it was very big. It was probably left out and guarded and then maybe brought in during the night. But we don't really know. But the people do think that its size is consistent with a religious center, so it does have some support that this is a place that was used for worship. I talked about the Omri dynasty. I'm going to go ahead and skip past all of this because we already covered that. I just really wanted to go over the large portion of the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel, as we talk about the kingdom of Judah. This lasted much longer, and there's normally a reason that people think this one lasted much longer. You might say that the kings were more shrewd, but the Bible uses a standard of judgment based on how well, basically two factors. Did they follow God? And did they create reforms that pushed people in the direction of following God? Typically, the two kings there are kings that are labeled as good or bad, and I think there's only 6 in the kingdom, maybe 7, depending on how you count it. Both the First Kings and First and Second Chronicles uses a slightly different standard of what is good and what is bad. Chronicles labels Solomon as a good king. The First Kings labels Solomon as a bad king, and that's ultimately because that's where Solomon ended up. Even though he did a lot of good things, he turned away from the Lord. You can kind of see this picture is much better than the one I had on the other map where the dividing line is, just a little bit north of the Dead Sea, stopping between Ai and Jericho. Do you guys remember Ai and Jericho in the Bible? Most people know the Battle of Jericho, where Joshua brought the walls down. You guys remember that story? And then Joshua decides he's going to go take out the smaller town of Ai, and he says, we only need like 3,000 people to do this, and they get their butts handed to them, defeated because of the sin at Jericho. Well, here you can kind of see how close together they are. I don't know there's no, what do they call that thing where they have the distance in miles? There's a word for that. I don't remember what it is at the top of my head. But I know Israel is about 60 miles wide and about 120 miles north to south. So at most, that's probably like around 30 miles-ish, if I had to guess. Not 30 miles, that's not even that. More like 10 miles. So probably not very far. They would have got there pretty easily. But you can kind of see that that kind of acts as like the dividing line between where the north and the south is, showing that Jerusalem and Bethel, both important religious centers, were very, very close together. That you could probably make a day's march between one, not march, but day's trip from one to the other. Though going towards Jerusalem would have been a lot harder than going towards Bethel, because you always have to walk up towards Jerusalem and walk down from Jerusalem. Always harder to walk up than it is to walk down. We see that this kind of starts in, as I said before you were here, Miss Lucinda, that this kind of starts with a divide that is seen in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 16 through 19. When all of Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, and the people answered the king, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David." So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. The king Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was the taskmaster over the forced labor, and all of Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to his mount, his chariots, to flee Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against all the house of David to this day, which really shows that King Rehoboam had no mindset when it came to ruling people. Do you know what a taskmaster is? Do you know what it is, Miss Lucinda? Yeah. Yeah, and in this case, the taskmaster is the one holding the whip. And so, like, well, you're trying to unite people, and he's trying to unite them with fear and punishment. And what's the advice that his, this was the advice of his young people. What was the advice of the old elders to him? It's to lessen their burden. Do the opposite of this. Do the opposite of this, you'll win their hearts. And yeah, be kind and compassionate ruler. And so, obviously, by this point, because Solomon had a lot of forced labor to build the palace and build the temple. And so people were tired of that. It was always supposed to be temporary anyway, and it seemed to continue. And it created a lot of problems that his son desired to continue. And it certainly didn't work for this. They might have loved Solomon for building the temple, but this is not the father, this is the son, and you did not give us what the father gave us, so why should we listen to you? So it says, so all of Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. What does that statement, "to this day," mean? So we see this statement right here, this very last one, "to this day." Yes, it means it's still happening right now, or at least happening at the time that this book was written. And we can assume that this book is written at least till Babylonian exile. So that means that the person is writing about these events, and the way that someone might chronologize the history of America today, starting, we'll say 931 to 586, that's roughly 400 years. 586. That's roughly 400 years. American history starting around 1600, and our government starts much later than that, but our history starts around the 1600s. So that's about 400 years. No, I mean, I wouldn't take that, because they don't know that. The writer is probably just referencing their own time period. So if I'm the one writing the book, right, and I wrote "to this day," I mostly mean to the point that I'm writing right now. But yeah, and well, that's what I was talking about. That's why I said it's roughly 400 years that he might even be writing this in Babylonian exile for all we know. Um, I don't know who is credited with writing the book of First and Second Kings. Samuel normally gets credit for First and Second Samuel, but that covers his death, so that doesn't make much sense. But First and Second Kings, there's probably someone who gets the credit for it. Yeah, it is a history lesson. I wonder, now I'm going to have to go look that up. If I had to guess, I would say either Jeremiah or Ezra. But those are also separated by like 100 years easily, because Jeremiah was pre-exile and Ezra was post-exile. But that's just my guess. I mean, you can go and see what people actually say. So let's cover the kings of Judah, and this is just as outlined in the Bible. We see Rehoboam was king for about, 20 or 17 years, 18 years, and he is considered to be a bad king, largely because, as the text indicates, that one, he didn't listen to the wisdom of his fathers, two, allowed the kingdom to divide, but three, and most importantly, led them to idolatry. He is replaced by his son, Abijah, who lasted for about 2 years. The text says mostly bad. In fact, the text concludes bad, but we do see some good, a little bit of good here. There's a little bit reliance on God, which is probably why his son, Asa, turned out so well in the first place. Not only did it declares him a good king, but the Bible declares that he trusted in God and removed the idols that people were worshiping in the first place. He, in turn, is replaced by Jehoshaphat, who is not only good, but brings about spiritual reforms for the people of Judah. We see that he also fought along the side of some of the kings in the, or at least one of the kings in the northern kingdom, but I cannot remember which one at the top of my head. I know that there was this plan where he was supposed to supposedly wear the armor of the king of the north, with the point of that they were really going after the king of the north, and it kind of backfired on him. But the Bible declares him a good king because he followed God and made actual spiritual changes towards God. Jeroboam, 843 to 841, considered bad. He's married into the Ahab family, and we know that from that, they were just not a good family at all. This is the only non-king, I think, in the Bible that we see of, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name. It's Athaliah. She is called the usurping queen, and not only was she bad, but she actively promoted idolatry. In this case, she promoted Baal worship. And Baal is I think he's the lightning god of the Canaanite world, and I use the term God loosely. It doesn't mean that he's a god, it's just what people believed. Joash, mostly bad, or began well and fell away. This is much like in the case of Solomon. Amaziah, 796 to 762 BC. Again, much like Joash, started out well, later gave into pride and sin. He is replaced by Uzziah, who is considered to be a good king, but eventually, like most things, especially some of his father and his grandfather, he struggled with the exact same problems, and that is he had to deal with pride. Jotham, 750 to 732, is considered to be a good king in the Bible. Overall, faithful, nothing bad to really say about him. Isaiah, 731 to 716, very, very bad. Not only did he practice idolatry, but he also practiced child sacrifice. This is Moloch worship, I believe, of what it is, and considered heinous as far as the Bible is concerned. Ironically, we're going to find between two very bad kings, one very, very good king. In fact, Hezekiah becomes mostly the standard for the good king. There's probably one king that gets higher praise than Hezekiah, but we see that his story is probably the most exhaustive story of the kings next to David. We see this largely has to do with his belief in God, his deliverance of Israel, his major changes to religious reforms, tearing down those high places, and making sure that the people were properly worshiping the way that they were supposed to worship. Did he always do the right thing? No. There's at least one black spot on his record, which seems to indicate the direction grab the attention of Babylon, which is going to be Assyria is where Assyria loses with Hezekiah, but in the end he gets the attention of Babylon, which is going to eventually lead Israel into exile. Manasseh, I love Manasseh. Last year, St. Andrews did a summer series on kings of the Bible, and they assigned me Manasseh, and I'm like, oh, can't even remember much about Manasseh. I think he was a bad king, and then I started reading his story, and I'm like, no, he's a very bad king. In fact, the Bible concludes he is one of the most wicked kings that there is. However, even though the Bible concludes him to be a bad king, the Bible also records his repentance. Eventually, he is captured, and it says he had his led away by having his nose ring and pulled by that nose ring. It sounds very, very unpleasant. But eventually, this leads to his repentance. So, can I say that, yeah, he was not a very good king for his people, but maybe when it actually mattered, he turned to the Lord and repented? And I don't know, maybe Manasseh is one of those people we'll see in heaven. Amon, 643 to 631, bad. Not a lot is said about him. He only lasted 2 years. Didn't really have a great example, and gave in some wicked practices. And Josiah, this is probably Hezekiah's contemporary. If he's good, Josiah is considered very good. And not only is he good, he is considered to be the last good king of the Bible. And probably the most important thing happens here with Josiah. It says during his time, the book of the law was discovered. And they used this book of the law to treat people right. Now, when I first started teaching this particular class, we talked about something called the documentary hypothesis. Do you guys remember do you guys remember this when I talked about that? No? Okay. It's been a long time because we've been doing this class for a very long time. Let me give you a very brief overview of what the documentary hypothesis is. The documentary hypothesis postulates that the first 5 books of the Bible were not written by one author, but by at least 4. And they are what they call the J, E, P, and D source. That is labeled by a few different things, but some of it is like how in Genesis chapter 1, the Bible always calls God Yahweh. But in Genesis chapter 2, Elohim. But in Genesis chapter 2, it starts using Yahweh. But then it will go back and forth. And so they speculate that these were 2 separate stories, and their stories were later combined. I don't know how much stock I want to talk into that, but part of this is, when we talked about that, we talked about J, I think it's J and E. Yeah, J and E going back and forth between Genesis and Exodus, and then E comes to be the priestly source, and that's Leviticus, and I think Numbers gets J and E. But Deuteronomy gets its own special category, is because they believe the book of Deuteronomy is the book that Josiah discovers. It is basically a retelling of Exodus and Numbers with some Leviticus sprinkled in there. And so it seems, and it uses different language, but its language is rather consistent. So a lot of people believe that Deuteronomy wasn't written until this time period, and it was treated as a discovery. Is that true? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Probably not. That's why I talked about canon. When we talked about canon in the beginning, what books made it into the Bible, is we're trying to decide if, one, if they're inspired, and two, if they're consistent with other teachings. And we can look at Deuteronomy, and we can look at Numbers, and we can look at Leviticus, and we can look at Exodus, and say that those stories are rather consistent. There are some name changes differently, like one uses Mount Horeb, and the other one uses Mount Sinai, but that doesn't necessarily mean the plain meaning of the text has changed. All right, so this is where this is supposedly the Deuteronomy sources, the book that Josiah discovered. To me, it doesn't really matter if it was discovered at this point or written much earlier. It was a book that gets accepted as canon, and it is in agreement with the rest of Jewish canon. After that, we're not going to see any good. We're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4 bad kings with at least two different kings being taken into exile. Jehoiakim from 609 to 586 BC, he gets carted off into exile. It's the one after him. I should just read my notes. And then finally, all of Israel, except maybe some non-important farmers, get carted off into exile and removed for at least how many years? Does anybody know how long exile lasted? What? Nope. You're counting time from you're using the just the actual exile. The actual exile, I think, was only 70 years long. Any questions on all of that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I agree. You get a little bit of power, and that power goes to your head. And even if your power is figurative, like I have no power here. I cannot make decisions. I'm not really supposed to do anything without their approval. But when people think of the church, they don't think of them. They think of me because I'm the one that everybody sees. So in a way, I mean, we're figureheads, but even that could easily go to your head. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And I would never go to a church without elders because I don't want that responsibility. I do not want to do what elders want to do. Harry always says that being an elder is the next stage of my development in ministry, and I don't want to do it at all. I think men should aspire to grow in their faith, which I absolutely agree. Men should want to be deacons in the church. Because everybody should want to be servants for God. But that being an elder is not an easy job, but it's often a very thankless job, and they get treated with a lot of contempt sometimes. So it's like I don't know if I want to do that. Anyway, so we're going to talk about this story that we see in Rehoboam. I started off as one thing. I immediately pivoted to something else. I guess I didn't change my... I was going to talk about the different kings individually, kind of like how I talked about the different kings or the Omri dynasty that we just went over. But I realized that, one, there's not a lot of archaeological evidence until we get into Hezekiah. And two, that really wasn't the purpose of this class anyway. The purpose of this class was to look at the actual archaeology evidence or things going on that surround the culture or what people are saying about this. And so I want to point out there is something that takes place in this particular verse that most people aren't really paying a whole lot of attention to. Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, in the city that the Lord had chosen out all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah, the Amorite, and Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him with jealousy in the sins they committed more than all their fathers had done. All right, so then if you're going to go on to read, you're going to read about this guy named Shishak. Who is Shishak? Does anybody know? Well, the Bible actually mentions Shishak quite a bit. I have the actual number here. Forgot what it is. Yeah, can't find it. All right, well, we'll just go with what I always say. Where did I say that? Is it there? Oh, it was in the title? Yes, okay, 7 times. The Bible mentions Shishak 7 times. And we can see this as earlier in chapter 12, verses 2 through 9, where it says, in the 5th year, King Rehoboam, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. And the people were without number who came with him to Egypt, Libya, Suchecki, and Ethiopians. And he took the fortified cities of Judea and came as far as Jerusalem. Then Shemaiah the prophet came to Rehoboam and the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak, and said to them, thus said the Lord, you have abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to Shishak. And so this is a lot of most of what Shishak is. There's also, we see Shishak mentioned earlier, I think in chapter 11, or maybe chapter 10, when it first introduces Jeroboam. Jeroboam was originally, worked in Solomon's house, or worked for Solomon, but eventually he turned against Solomon, and Solomon pursued him, and he fled to Egypt, and he took refuge under Shishak. Now, this is really good for us, because this gives us the name of a specific Egyptian king. Now, most of the time when the Bible refers to an Egyptian king, it refers to that Egyptian king as Pharaoh. How does that help us? Oh, sorry, let me rephrase the question. What's the problem with referring to the king as Pharaoh? Everybody's Pharaoh. So who are we talking about when we're talking about Pharaoh? So when Joseph is second in command of all of Pharaoh's household, well, which Pharaoh? And we don't really see a Joseph labeled in Pharaoh's household in any history book, so that makes it a little difficulty to nail down the time period. However, Shishak actually gives us a specific name. And not only that, but we have a very big mural that we've discovered that also gives credence to what is happening here in 1 Kings chapter 12. So, Shishak is also known as Pharaoh Suchecki the first, and we see variations of that name, Shishonik, Shashank, Shishonik, or Shishak. All of these are acceptable names for this particular pharaoh based on its various spellings and probably the other nations that he dealt with. He ruled Egypt around 945, 934 BC, and during what is called the Egypt's third intermediate period. Now, I know this really doesn't mean a whole lot to you, and we're not studying Egyptology to really figure out how this might be important, but I bring this up because this period is largely marked as a fragmented period where Egypt was, for the most part, relatively weak. Now, this is important because Judea and Israel are kind of in that position between Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria to the north, making it a kind of like gateway between these two. And Solomon, and a lot of people believe that one of the reasons that Solomon was able to expand the kingdom that he did was because Egypt was relatively weak at that time period. Probably one of the reasons that it was weak is because Shishak is not Egyptian. Shishak is Libyan or Lebanese, and it is sometimes called the Libyan dynasty. Oh, this is the one I was thinking of. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 40. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled into the kingdom unto Shishak, king of Egypt, that was in Egypt until the death of King Solomon. So, because the Bible specifically mentions this king, and we can trace this king's dynasty through archaeology, that we can pinpoint that Solomon and Rehoboam and Jeroboam all lived somewhere between 945 and 934 BC. We see a little bit different. People think that these reign, as I talked about, Rehoboam probably started his reign around 941. So we now have a numbers problem, especially when compared to other nations. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Keep that in mind. He's mentioned 7 times in the Bible, mostly in reference to those 2 stories with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and then the repeat of those 2 stories in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 2 through 9. There it is, all there. And probably most importantly is the Egyptian account of the Shishak campaign into this particular area of the world. This is like a sketch drawing of what it is. Here is the actual thing. Isn't that really cool? That this thing is just on the side of the wall somewhere. It is on the Karnak Temple in Luxor. It has a 20-foot tall gate, and it is called the Bubasite Portal. And you can see the inscription and the illustration on the right-hand side of the gate. And basically what it says, this is another picture of it right here, gives the account of the king and the god Atum leading the enemies by rope. Now, I'm a little confused by the account that I'm reading, because it tells me the account I was reading says both the king and Atum are on the right side, which makes no sense in that picture. So I'm not really exactly sure. I think there might be a misprint in the thing that I was reading, or a mistake in the thing I'm reading. But if I had to guess, that the middle one is probably the king, and the one on the other side is the god Atum. I don't know. Someone who, I looked for 3 different things, and they all seem to share the same source, that it didn't look like someone either explained it very well or made a mistake and they all copied the same mistake. So in front of, and then you can look at the smaller one, the individual one. It's kind of probably hard to see, but you could see this, they look like little ovals from there. I don't know what that looks like from your perspective, but these are actually pictures of individual people and places called a cartouche, which is a hieroglyphic inscription showing the individual names in towns and cities that were captured to him, including many places in the land of Judea and northern Israel. In fact, one translation says, many of the cartouches have been weathered and damaged beyond eligibility. Still, a majority can be read, revealing many familiar locations from the Bible accounts, such as Ajalon, Gibeon, Megiddo, Skolach, and Arad. One of the most intriguing places references the field of Abram, which is broadly identified as the earliest extra-biblical reference to the name of the patriarch. These neatly ordered rows of cartouches' name reveals the Shishak's path of conquest took him nearly as far as the Sea of Galilee into the north and down to the Negev desert in the south. So, we have both a biblical count and we have both an archaeological count found by a non-biblical source confirming that there was conquest by a king who took over many of these cities. It's great. We want to see more stuff like this. We'll see some little stuff like this paying tribute, but probably the next biggest thing that we see is King, how do you say this? Sennacherib? 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 Okay, I was very close. Sennacherib. Who is King Sennacherib? Nobody? Have you heard of him before? No? Really? All right, King Sennacherib is the king of Assyria in Nineveh, and he lived during the time of, any guess which king? He lived during the time of Hezekiah. And because King Sennacherib is going to well document his conquest against Hezekiah, Hezekiah, by non-biblical scholars, is considered the first real king of the southern kingdom of Judea, because we can see actual proof and nameage of him in King Sennacherib's conquest. The Bible mentions him a lot more than it mentions the Egyptian king. I think it mentions him 20 times. I might have that on there somewhere. I'll come back to it in a second. He supposedly lived from 705 to 681 BC, where he is assassinated by his son. And this is what the Bible says, and we actually see some proof of this, which I will show you later on. He's the second king of the Sargonoid dynasty, most remembered for his campaign in the Levant and capturing the biblical city of Lachish. 17 times in the Bible, that's how. Ultimately, his kingdom is destroyed by Babylon, and that is the official end of the Assyrian dynasty. We could say that he is quite an ambitious king. His fathers not only captured the north and brought him into exile, but he has turned his sights on the southern kingdom. And as the king of Assyria was sent to Tartan and Rabsaris and the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And they went up and came down to Jerusalem, where they arrived, and they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is the highway of the washer's field. Well, he lost in Jerusalem. Yes. But he won in Lachish. And we have a lot of proof of that. This room, as you can see here, is what remains of the Lachish reliefs. You see those giant pictures? These are stone carvings that they've removed from the actual palace and put, I actually think this is the British Museum. I might be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure this is the British Museum. I have it written down later. Where they've attempted to preserve these relics documenting the battle at Lachish. What's Lachish? Well, Lachish was considered to be one of the most fortified city in Judea, next to Jerusalem itself. So if you were going to lead a campaign into Judea, you probably wouldn't want to start with Jerusalem. You would want to start with the fortified cities. So eventually Jerusalem at its strongest stood alone with no other support for it. You could see, here's some pictures of the Lachish reliefs. So after he eventually captures Lachish, after returning to Nineveh, he commissioned a series of reliefs to display his greatness, largely probably based on some sketches that were done during the actual battle himself, and he had them built into carved rock that show eventually in the southern city of Nineveh, which showed the battle and the surrender of the city. They were discovered in 1847 AD by Austin Henry Lanyard doing excavations in the city of Nineveh, but they were probably carved sometime around the time that King Sennacherib died. They are many, many different sections, some as wide as 12 meters. Well, how long is 12 meters? That's probably, about 18 feet? It's pretty long. Some of them as long as that. 5 meters long. Oh, yes, and you can currently go and see them in the British Museum because like all great artifacts, pillaged from the ancient world, they are found in the British Museum of Antiquities. They need to give some of those back. But if you want to do something that's probably, in my opinion, a lot more interesting, you can hop on a plane and go to Israel, and you can walk up to the Tel Lachish. I don't actually know if that's what it's called. And you can walk around the area and actually see for yourself. This is a picture that I took. I got a chance to see Lachish. And I remember our teacher at the time pulled us over, and he's like, "You see that pile of rocks right there?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And I go, "It's just the hillside." He goes, "No, that is the siege ramp that the Assyrians built after surrounding the city." I don't actually know if I have a picture. This is the other side where you can see the entrance into the city. So, why would you build a siege ramp? Well, the problem with it is the way that the entrance to the city was built, is you had walls here, gate, road in front of the walls, and then gate over here. So to breach the gate, you had the wall right here, and what's the problem with that? Well, no. So let's pretend that I'm on the wall, right? And this row in front of me represents the road. And over there represents the gate. Now you want to breach the gate, but what's the problem with breaching the gate? Is now I'm the wall right here, and I can stand over you, and then I can pour hot oil, I can shoot you in the head, I can throw rocks at you. I mean, it was a very nice fortification, so to stop that, they built the siege ramp to bypass the wall, the gate altogether, and just barge their way in. Originally, when they discovered this, they started digging on this side of the city, and then they realized that what they were digging into was a siege ramp, so they had to stop that. This was the other picture I took. That's the palace at Lachish, the king's palace. Eventually, once they breached the gate, and there's probably very little fighting at that point, there's probably conditional surrender, where they just marched right in. The Bible says that eventually he goes home in defeat after trying to capture Jerusalem. That doesn't work out for him, and he's assassinated by one of his sons. This was a kind of stone slab. There's a name for it. I actually didn't write down what that name is. And it seems to give some indication that this is how he actually died. Sennacherib, a great king, strong king, king of Assyria, unrivaled king, pious shepherd, who reveres the great gods, guardians of truth, who love justice, renders assistance, goes to the aid of the weak, strives after good deeds, perfect man, virile, I don't even know what that word is, warrior, foremost of all rulers, the bridle that controls the submissive, and the one who strikes enemy with lightning is eventually killed by one who trusts. All right, so, but the archaeological count doesn't just end there with Lachish, but there is a response, because we know that he's not going to be content with Lachish. He's going to move on to Jerusalem. Now, how do you destroy a city like Jerusalem? Jerusalem has two good things going for it. One, it is on top of a mountain. Being on top of a mountain makes it very, very difficult to build a siege ramp. The second thing that has a problem with it is it's very strong fortified walls. So you can't just march into it, and you just can't build a siege ramp around it. So what are you to do? You starve it. And so Hezekiah's response was to go and burn all the fields and block up all the water. So he's like, well, you might try to starve us, but you're going to have the same problem. As I said, the same Hezekiah closed up the outer waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David, and Hezekiah prospered in all of his works. So not only did he stop up the water, but he redirected the water into the city so that his enemy had no water, but they themselves did. Now, this was not a very easy feat to do because you can't just direct water into a mountain because you have to cut through the mountain to do it. And the fastest, when you know an enemy is coming, well, the fastest way to do this is you work at both ends. It's not like modern equipment where you take a machine to cut through rock and use dynamite. And so what they did was they dug one side to the other in an S pattern. It was discovered as Hezekiah's tunnel. I loved it. It was cool. I got to walk through the whole tunnel. And you can walk through the water that they dug into the city. That water is still there. It goes up to about to your waist at its highest. You can see, there's me, and you can see the bottom of my pants that are wet. And this is a picture I took. This is like really early in the tunnel. On the one side, you can see that my head is almost touching the roof there as comparison. This is a picture of my professor, and you can see it's much, much higher here. So what they ended up having to do is they had to dig down to meet the other end. But the tunnel is a 1,750-foot tunnel carved during the reign of Hezekiah to bring water from the city from one side and the other, made in an S shape. Why would they make it in an S shape? No? Let's say you're digging in a straight line. Let's say the other part are digging in the straight line. What do you want to happen? You want to meet. But if your straight line is over here and my straight line is over here, are we going to meet? No. So you're digging in an S shape. So at that point, so you might, if you're both digging in the S shape, you widen your route. So this is the second longest tunnel of this time period. I don't actually remember. I remember that was something I learned in archaeology a long time ago, but I can't remember who actually is in the first. It's mentioned, has two mentions in the Bible. The first one I mentioned here in 2 Chronicles. The second one I have mentioned here in 1 Kings chapter 20. When it was discovered, and it empties into the pool of Siloam. This is a pool that Jesus references in his own teachings when he talks about how when the waters would be stirred up, you would try to go into the waters so you could be healed of your ailment. Probably, and that water was fed from the spring of Gihon, connected from Hezekiah's tunnel. Little interesting bit of archaeological there. When it was discovered with this inscription here. This is not the real, this is a picture I took. I mean, you can't really see it because there's not a good way. It's like you have this much space, and it's still really hard to take a picture. But this is the inscription that was found. This is a replica inscription because the actual inscription was looted. And this is basically what it says. It's called the Siloam inscription. When the tunnel was driving through, and this was the way in which it was cut through, while we were still axes each man towards his fellow, and while there were still 3 cubits to be cut through, there was heard the voice of a man calling to his fellows, and there was an overlap in the rock on the right and the left, and when the tunnel was driven through, the quarryman hewed each man towards his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed through the spring towards the reservoir for 1,200 cubits. The height of the rock above the head of the quarryman was 100 cubits. This is because he's talking about how they had to dig down to meet them. It means that they could hear them, but they couldn't necessarily see them. So they eventually had to dig to make sure that they got where they needed to be. And this is the death of Sennacherib. This is called the Eshar prison. This is an Israeli. I mixed up. I was saying that this was the thing that recorded his death. It wasn't. It's this thing right here, which alludes to his sons being killed, his son ascending to the throne because of his assassination. All right. Any questions about any of that? Everybody good? Makes a lot of sense? Great. Do you still have that book I gave you? Do you still have that book I gave you a second ago? Okay. All right. So the next thing, I don't have time to talk about all of this, and we're going to probably have to talk about this next time. But as you can see in some of what we talked about, especially trying to label this or figure this out, with King Sennacherib and the Egyptian king is that some of the dates don't necessarily line up for what we talk about. And even just taking them at a plain reading of this happened for 40 years and this king was king for 20 years, one of the biggest problems that has perplexed scholars is wondering if these dates are accurate. And so many people have tried to reconcile that system by guessing what's actually going on here. And probably the best attempt at it was done by a man, as you can see right here, Edward Thiele, who wrote this book called The Mysterious Number of the Hebrew Kings. What he's going to do, and what we're going to talk about next time, is he's going to address what the actual problems are. He identifies 6 problems, and he's going to reconcile those 6 problems with finding a correct dating system. So if you want to look at this book, this is my copy. I don't care if you borrow it. I have not read it since my undergrad. I thumbed through it. I thumbed through it last week to identify his 6 actual areas to address, so I could talk about those 6. But I would suggest that at least looking at chapter 2 and ignoring everything else. But yeah, here it is if you need it. Anybody want it? Okay. All right, and that's all we got today. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate you. I was so worried.